All right, let's get the latest then from the U.S. Sherwin Bryce Pease now joins us for the very latest. A good day to you, Sherwin. Thanks very much for availing yourself at this time. While the focus, the focus is, of course, continues to be very much on what's playing out on the ground in Ukraine. Some focus today also at what will be happening at the United Nations. And I'm looking at my screen to the left here as what's currently happening is about to take place, particularly the United Nations Security Council. What's the latest on this vote expected later?
Well, as you well know, Flo, the UN Security Council convened in emergency sessions twice into the late night on Monday and on Wednesday this week at the request of the Ukrainian ambassador, given the escalation that we have now witnessed from the Russian Federation. And it was on Wednesday night that Linda Thomas-Greenfield, the US ambassador to the United Nations, articulated the fact that she would be putting a draft resolution to a vote before the end of this week. A draft resolution, Flo, that essentially calls for Russia to respect the sovereignty, independence, unity and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, essentially the borders that all 193 member states of the United Nations subscribe to. It decides that the Russian Federation shall immediately cease its use of force against Ukraine and refrain from any further invalid threat or use of force against any UN member state. It also requests that Russia remove its troops from Ukraine immediately and talks also about the facilitation of humanitarian needs in that region. But of course, as we also know, the UN Security Council has 5 permanent members that have a veto. They wield a veto. Russia is both a protagonist to this conflict, but also a permanent 5 member of a Security Council that is responsible for the maintenance of peace and security. So the expectation here is that Russia will veto this resolution. In fact, the U.S. Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield tweeting this overnight: Russia's attack on the Ukraine is an attack on the UN Charter and every UN member state. Tomorrow, this was last night, referring to today, the Security Council will vote on a resolution to hold Russia accountable. We are asking every UN member state to co-sponsor this action in Ukraine's hour of need. Now, that sort of appeal is unlikely to sway Russia in terms of its veto power. So expect that veto to fall. We don't know if China will support a veto as well. Remember, they're also a P5 member, or whether China will abstain or vote in favor of this. The intention of U.S. diplomats here is to further demonstrate Russia's isolation, come the veto or not. And if this resolution fails as expected, the move then among diplomats is to take a different resolution, probably with some of the similar aspects, to the UN General Assembly. The difference here is that, unlike the UN Security Council, the General Assembly is very likely to pass such a resolution, but it will have no legal effect. It will not become international law as a resolution that passes the Security Council does. This will sort of demonstrate the moral inclinations of where the international community stands, but it certainly won't force Russia's hand, or certainly President Vladimir Putin's hand, in terms of the withdrawal of those troops and the recognition of Ukraine's international boundaries.
Now, of course, President Cyril Ramaphosa has called for the United Nations Security Council to play a larger mediation role in this conflict. In fact, we just played that clip. Critical also that he does not believe we are seeing the Council's full engagement on this issue. Has there been any reaction to the President's statement as yet, Sherwin?
We haven't had official reaction. I've certainly reached out to the Secretary General's office. I've also reached out to analysts. I'm due to speak to someone in about an hour's time. But, you know, I imagine there would be some pushback, certainly from members in the UN Security Council that have met in a number of sessions just this week. There is a vote in terms of efforts here to coalesce Russia in terms of withdrawing their troops. You know, the big powers, be it Emmanuel Macron of France, Olaf Scholz of Germany, Antony Blinken, the US President, president, the diplomatic path still remains open to Moscow, based on certainly what we've heard from the United States president, from Western allies, from Boris Johnson, from various European leaders. There has been a big push to find a diplomatic solution. There have also been exchanges in terms of Russia's concerns regarding NATO's expansion in Eastern Europe, written responses between both sides in terms of finding a diplomatic solution to this. But I would also refer you to what President Biden said yesterday, that this is not about Russia's security. It is more about, Vladimir Putin seeking to regenerate and reinvigorate the USSR, the Soviet Union of old. And so there is a lot of disagreement about what that sort of negotiation would look like. I did reach out to a human rights analyst, and this was his response on background. So I can't name him, but I'll read what you said, Flo. What he said to me, Flo. My personal view is the Secretary General has been pretty good with his condemnation of Russia of late, belatedly but good and long overdue. And he's now referring to the Secretary General's very clear call on Russia to withdraw their troops in the name of humanity, to quote the Secretary General. But he's also called out this very aggressive violation of the UN Charter. And, he is, the chief administrator here of the United Nations, and what informs UN operations is very much the UN Charter. So the Secretary General believes that his defense of the UN Charter is certainly within his purview. The analyst goes on to say the Secretary General's been too soft with the P5, referring to the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. Still, I don't think the SG has any leverage on this. This is geopolitics of the worst kind, and the Secretary General is a kitten running around at the feet of charging elephants. So, that quite a prescient statement from this analyst. The Secretary General, in addition to that, Flo, has what you call the good officer's role, right? The SG is seen as a neutral force in terms of conflicts, in terms of international geopolitical disagreements. He has the ability to appoint a mediator, but as this analyst is saying, if it's not the Secretary General himself, and even if it is the Secretary General himself, does he have the leverage here when you are dealing with the likes of Russia, when you are dealing with the likes of the United States and NATO? And certainly the position that he's sharing here is that perhaps the SG is not the perfect person for this role. But of course, I think President Cyril Ramaphosa would disagree with that.
Well, of course, there is also a growing concern that as Ukraine comes under increased bombardment, that NATO might step in military, given its close proximity. Is there any scenario where NATO could come to Ukraine's defense, given its desire to be part of the alliance?
Not in terms of Article 5 of NATO. You have to be a member of the alliance before, so an attack on one is an attack on all. That principle does not apply to Ukraine, despite its intention or its desire to join NATO. And of course, this is a big sticking point with Moscow and President Putin in particular. So the short answer is that based on NATO's rules, its governing structure, it cannot come to Ukraine's defense, right? So the short answer is no. President Biden did address this when he was announcing new sanctions against Russia yesterday. This is what he said about U.S. troops, or certainly NATO troops on the ground. Watch.
Putin has committed an assault on the very principles that uphold the global peace. But now the entire world sees clearly what Putin and his Kremlin allies are really all about. This was never about a genuine security concerns on their part. It was always about naked aggression, about Putin's desire for empire by any means necessary, by bullying Russia's neighbors through coercion and corruption, by changing borders by force, and ultimately by choosing a war without a cause. Putin's actions betray his sinister vision for the future of our world, one where nations take what they want by force. But it is a vision that the United States and freedom-loving nations everywhere will oppose with every tool of our considerable power.
So the president continuing there, although we provide over $650 million in defensive assistance to Ukraine just this last year, let me say it again, our forces are not and will not be engaged in a conflict with Russia in Ukraine. Our forces are not going to Europe to fight Ukraine. And the president there talking about how NATO was bolstering its eastern flank in countries like Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Latvia, Slovenia. Those are already former Baltic states. In fact, they are Baltic states that are now already members of NATO. And so he is shoring up their defenses in those NATO allied states. But unfortunately, that does not apply certainly to Ukraine and certainly from the Ukraine perspective, Flo.
Sure, and slightly off topic though, but just before we let you go, breaking news, of course, coming out of Washington. President Joe Biden nominating Federal Appeals Court Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson as the first black woman on the U.S. Supreme Court. A lot of talk about that, and in fact, I've been watching on social media, and some have been saying that this might prove at long last whether or not we can say that the U.S. is racist or not. What can you tell us about this?
Yeah, in the long history of the U.S. Supreme Court, right? They've never had a black female sit on the highest court in the land. This was a big campaign promise of President Joe Biden, confirmed, of course, after the resignation of the latest Associate Justice a month ago, and now confirming that Ketanji Brown Jackson, who currently sits on the U.S. Appeals Court for the D.C. Circuit. She was confirmed to that position by the United States Senate last year by a vote of 53 to 44. She will now have to start afresh with a completely new Senate confirmation hearing, a Senate confirmation process. And of course, these often display the very vast divisions in terms of political views on jurisprudence in the United States. So she will certainly, with the support of the lobbying that has been happening behind the scenes by the White House, meet now with a number of senators and begin this process, share her views on jurisprudence. But her entire history as a judge will now be evaluated by all those senators, all 100 of them. And then, of course, she will face a confirmation hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee. Those are public affairs, so we'll get to know Ketanji Brown Jackson in a very public way. And certainly President Biden fulfilling a campaign promise today in terms of nominating her to the highest court in the land.
Sherwin, always a pleasure to see you and hear from you. Many thanks to you as always. Sherwin Bryce Pease reporting for us live from New York there. Let's carry on.